Hi. Something smell weird to you? Does your brew taste kind of funky? Well, stay tuned. Let's talk about that. Welcome everyone to my channel. This is Northwest Small Batch Brewing. I'm Steven. And today I want to talk a little bit about what can go wrong in your brew. In other words, if you know what went wrong, maybe you can fix it the next time, or you can avoid having an issue if you know some of the common problems that can come up with brewing and how to identify them and what causes them. So I'm just going to jump right in. It's going to be a lot of talking, unfortunately, from me and not a lot of stuff to show you. But a while back, I did a lot of research on some of the more common issues that can come up with brewing and what causes them, what their symptoms are, and how to mitigate them, right? How to make it so hopefully you don't have these issues. So some of these may not be in a 1 to 10 order, but I think for the most part, they're pretty much in like a most common to least common order. Anyway, let's start with the number one issue or type of infection you can get in your brew, and that is called DMS. DMS is dimethyl sulfide. So if you think of the word sulfide, sulfur, right? So this is a infection that smells like sulfur. So we're talking like, cooked cabbagey kind of rotten eggy kind of smell. This is caused by a chemical called DMS, or dimethyl sulfide. And you'll probably hear about this from other brewers if you watch on other channels. They might mention that this is a problem. This comes from not boiling your wort with the lid uncovered for a period of time. So it's a little bit of a misnomer here. Some brewers will tell you that you have to boil your wort in order to get rid of DMS. But it's a little bit untrue, because the reality is that your wort does not have DMS until you boil it. So what happens is you reach a certain temperature of heat in your wort and it starts creating this DMS chemical. So if you were never to boil your wort at all, you wouldn't have this problem. Of course, there are reasons to boil it. The most important I can think of is it's a really surefire way to make sure that everything is sanitized and clean, and when you do pitch your yeast, you're pitching it into a really clean environment. Yeah, so I mean, like if you've ever, I'm going to talk about this later in this video, but if you ever make like a raw ale, which is basically a no-boil ale, you don't have to worry about DMS, even though some people think that that's an issue, because you never really heat your wort up to a point that it would create that chemical. So the fix for it obviously is, if you do smell like a rotten egg cabbage smell in your final product, next time make sure you've instigated a procedure where you're actually boiling your wort. Usually it's like for at least an hour, and you do it uncovered. It may mean you have to do it outside. If you do it inside, make sure you've got really good ventilation. You've got your fans on the stove, and you've got windows open so that the steam can get out of the house. All right, number two, diacetyl. You'll hear this one all the time on homebrewing channels. Diacetyl. This is the chemical that gives microwave popcorn the buttery flavor that you love. It's not really butter. I'm sure most of you already know that. It's just this chemical they use, which is not so good for you. But it is also something that will impart that same buttery or butterscotchy kind of flavor to your beer, which sometimes some people like, but for the most part, it's not something you really want. So what causes it so it's basically the yeast that cause it. What happens is your yeast, as it's fermenting, it actually expels diacetyl into your wort, into your beer. And so if you try to stop your fermentation too soon, so you think it's done, it's been 2 weeks, surely 2 weeks is enough time, it's definitely done. You take it, you put it into bottles or you keg it, and all of a sudden it's got this buttery taste. You bottled it too soon, is what happened. So the cool thing about yeast and the fact that it expels diacetyl into your beer is if you leave it long enough, it reabsorbs it back into itself. So the cure to this, and the reason that I personally will not bottle or keg my beer until it has sat and fermented for a full month, that's probably an overkill, but I do it, is because the yeast will reabsorb. Also, it's why I'm not a big fan of doing secondaries, at least not unless you've waited that full month. Because if you pull it off of the yeast, you rack it off of that yeast cake into a new container, now the yeast is gone, or the most part of it is gone, and it doesn't have the chance to reabsorb those off flavors. So one of the biggest things I can tell you as a home brewer is be patient and don't mess with it. Let it do its thing. Let it sit there. Don't lift the lid unless you absolutely have to. Just set it aside. And just like that infomercial from years ago, set it and forget it. All right, number 3, isovaleric acid. This one's not so common. This is going to sound so nasty, but sorry for the descriptions. It's a cheesy or sweaty sock smell. So gross. And this is caused by old or, basically it's old hops that have gone bad. I mean, hops have volatile oils in them. And so if you've had them sitting around too long, they can get moldy and bad and gross. And instead of helping your beer and giving it good, vibrant, flavors and smells, it does the opposite. So this, of course, the solution's obvious, right? Don't use old hops. So also the care of how you keep your hops is also important. So you're probably going to end up ordering, let's say your beer calls for a half an ounce of Cascade. You're only going to be able to order probably a full ounce. A lot of times you can't order smaller amounts. So you end up with, say, half an ounce left over. And you don't want to throw it out. You want to save it so you can use it in another beer. So what you do is you get yourself a food saver. And you put it in a food saver bag. You pull all the air out of the bag and seal it. And then you stick it in the freezer. And I'm telling you, it will keep for years if you do it that way. So that's that solution. So oxidation is talked about all the time. Again, this is another one like DMS and diacetyl, where you hear this all the time when it comes to homebrew is oxidation, oxidation. So much so that you now see people, the new trend is to do these closed transfers where you have a sealed up fermenter that's under pressure, and you do the whole fermentation under pressure, and then you use a CO2 tank and a keg to move it into another container or from your fermenter into a keg without ever opening it. Gosh, I have a lot of issues with this. First being that, just like with your cooking, like if you're a chef, if you don't taste your food and smell your food, you don't know what it's doing. So I have a problem with this, is if you don't know what your fermentation is doing during its whole process, how do you know what to fix? How do you know something's going wrong? You're just blindly hoping everything's good. And also, I don't think it's necessary. I've never done it, and I've never had an issue with oxidation. The biggest thing I can tell you is don't splash your beer when you're moving it from like your fermenter to your bottles, your keg, or secondary. Just use caution. Use a siphon, or use a setup where you have a spigot but a long hose that goes all the way to the bottom of the next container so that it doesn't splash. That's what's going to add oxygen and cause oxidation, is the splashing. probably opening the lid isn't really going to cause a problem. There's usually a layer of CO2 sitting on top of your brew anyway, so opening the lid is probably not enough to cause oxidation. But in case you're curious, what it will normally do if it does get oxidized, it give you kind of a wet paper or a wet cardboard type of smell or taste to your beer. All right, next one, number 5, hydrogen sulfide. That's another one of these sulfides, right? We talked about dimethyl sulfide, DMS, from the boiling issue. Hydrogen sulfide is a similar smell. It's like a rotten egg sort of smell. And this is similar to diacetyl in the sense that it's caused by yeast strain. You know, it's so important to treat your yeast well. So not only do you want to make sure your beer sits on the yeast for a long time to make sure your yeast can reabsorb off flavors, you don't want to stress your yeast. So this is why it's important not to pitch your yeast until your wort is at the right temperature. If it's too hot and you pitch your yeast, you're going to get these sort of off flavors that you'll get. Another off flavor that I have seen that's not this kind of rotten egg smell, but it's oftentimes referred to as the homebrew taste or the homebrew smell, right? When someone says, oh, yeah, it tastes like a homebrew. So that comes from, again, mistreating your yeast. If you pitch your yeast and it's too hot, it stresses the yeast out and it causes this, I call it a cidery or like green apple, like unripe fruit sort of flavor. Anyway, so the cause is, of course, not aerating your wort ahead of time to give it enough oxygen and stressing your yeast out by having it being too warm. Lactobacillus is the next one, number 6. You'll hear this a lot on home brewing. So lactobacillus is actually something that can actually be used. In some cases, it's actually really not an infection. It's the same thing you find in yogurt and dairy products. Gives you that little bit of a sour taste. So sometimes you'll have a beer that you want that, and that's the whole purpose of it. So you actually purposely introduce this. But normally you don't want it, and so the cure to this and the cure to almost all of the sort of infections is that you sanitize. Use Star San, which is what like 99% of homebrewers use. Use it correctly. Don't rinse it. Just dunk stuff in it or whatever. Spray it down. Let the excess drip off. But make sure you sanitize everything. It will solve 99% of your potential infections. Next one, Pediococcus. This one's nasty. I mean, it sounds nasty, right? It almost sounds like streptococcus, like when you get strep throat and stuff. Well, it's sort of nasty like that. It is something that you will not have any problem identifying. And I'll try to put pictures up of some of this stuff. Like this particular one, I'm going to try to put a picture up somewhere on this video here so you can see what it looks like. It's like a ropey, strandy kind of thing in your beer, which is why I say you'll know it when you see it. It doesn't affect the taste, interestingly enough, but obviously, the texture of drinking something that has nasty, ropey strands in it, it'd probably be pretty gross. So I will mention something about this, and that is that a lot of people think that hops will help keep your beer from getting an infection because hops are supposedly antibacterial or antimicrobial or whatever. And I've been watching some videos on people that work in labs that have tested this, and they have found a couple things that were fascinating. One of which is that hops really are not that antimicrobial. They are not going to keep you from getting an infection. So that's sort of an old wives' tale. In a sense, they've adapted. A lot of these bugs or these infections have adapted over time, and some of them actually rely on the hops to grow. And some of them rely on, the alcohol actually in the beer. So even having the alcohol in your beer is not a guarantee that you won't get an infection. It happens to everybody, and to a degree, there's nothing you can do. And to a degree, you're not even going to notice because it's not enough to cause a huge off flavor. But for this one, the fix for it is the same as everything else. sanitize everything. They say that you might be able to age this one out, this Pediococcus, but it takes like 6 months to a year. There's no guarantee that it will actually age out, and I think for most people, unless you've made a really, expensive, fancy homebrew, it's maybe probably not going to be worth trying to save on this one. Luckily, I've been brewing for a long time. I've never seen this in my brew, so I think it's pretty rare. Acetobacter. I hear a lot of homebrewers talk about this one a lot, and I'm not sure it's really that common, but you hear people talk about it. And I think the reason is because Acetobacter is sort of what's going to give a lot of those sour beers that you drink their sourness. This one and a Lactobacillus, right? Acetobacter is that real tart, vinegar almost sort of flavor. So again, this is one of those that's not going to be inhibited by hops. It doesn't care if you have hops in your beer. That's not going to stop it. What it is something that relies on a generous supply of oxygen and cannot actually grow in the absence of oxygen. So this one's important to pitch your yeast as soon as possible. I do a no-chill beer, so I actually break that rule. But as a general rule, if you're a new brewer, cooling your beer, your wort as quickly as possible, and then pitching the yeast right away will help stop something like Acetobacter from forming, because you're going to basically get the yeast going right away, and as soon as it starts creating that carbon dioxide, it's not going to have a lot of oxygen. It's going to push the oxygen out. So the fix for this one is keeping oxygen away from your beer after it's started to ferment, and obviously storing it properly in sealed, containers. All right, last two. Skunky Beer. This one, honestly, I never had this problem, but I just noted that it's basically caused by the type of bottle you use if you're bottling your beer. You've all seen Corona in its clear glass bottles. I mean, I'm not sure why they use those bottles. It's the worst possible bottle you can put a beer in. Basically, sunlight is what causes skunky beer. So you want to use the darkest colored glass bottle you can get. I mean, even Heineken with the green bottles is not the best option. You want to use the dark brown ones to keep as much light out as possible. And the last one here is phenol. Phenols can be good, actually. So, I mean, some people might consider it an infection, but it just depends. Phenols are actually from the yeast that give off flavors. And that's why I say sometimes it's good, because a lot of times you'll use a specific type or strand of yeast because you want the phenols that it's known for to be in your beer. That being said, what is it going to be if it's like an off flavor and it's caused by phenols from the yeast? Well, you're going to get maybe clove, like a strong clove flavor, or in my opinion, I think you're going to get more of a medicinal, smoky flavor. And I'm going to use this term because you'll hear it a lot in whiskey. Like if you're drinking an Islay Scotch that's real smoky. Got one behind me here, actually. This is not a whiskey channel, but this Lafroig has a very medicinal taste to it. So much so you can actually say that it might have a Band-Aid flavor. Sounds gross, but it's true. And that is caused by the phenols, these oils. And that's is often going to be seen like in smoky stuff. So the two ingredients most likely that would contribute to these volatile phenols are your water you're using and, surprise, surprise, because I just talked about smoky peated Scotch, smoked malts. So if you're doing a smoked beer, like a smoked malt, its potential to create these like Band-Aidy phenol smells are up there. Also, again, like the water. So if you're not using a smoky malt, your water, you'll see some people have really gotten into water chemistry. I don't do it. I think it's too much. I think it depends, I guess, where you live, right? If you have really bad tap water, I wouldn't use it. Like personally, I don't use tap water for my beer. I buy bottled spring water. Whatever you do, don't use distilled water or reverse osmosis water. If you do, in those cases, you are going to need to add back minerals and do a water sort of assessment. If you just buy mineral water or spring water, which will have natural minerals in it, you should be fine. These yeast needs the minerals. It's sort of like saying yeast nutrients. Some of it is, like zinc especially, is sort of like a yeast nutrient. So it's important to have that stuff and those minerals in your water. What you don't want is some of the junk that will come from municipal water, in part the sort of chlorine taste. And remember, a lot of places like where I live don't even use chlorine anymore. They use a chemical called chloranine, which is basically almost the same thing as chlorine. It tastes the same, has the same smell, but it doesn't evaporate. So even if you let water sit out like you used to be able to do in the old days, it won't evaporate. The next day, it's still going to be in there. And that's why they use it, because the further you are from the treatment plant, the higher a chance like normal chlorine would have already evaporated out, and then you're getting water that's not been treated anymore. So they use this chemical because they know it's going to reach your house still in the water. Unfortunately, it's not so great for your beer and the taste and whatnot. So you make your own decision. Some places are not going to be an issue where you live. Sometimes it's by house or by home, right? I have very old pipes that I just don't trust are not leaching, stuff from the pipes into the water. So I just don't use it for my brewing. Last thing, I know I'm getting probably long on this video, but just a very quick, short notice that I have also looked into the worst of the worst, which would be botulism. If you're doing a normal home brew, it's not going to be a problem. It's just not. Botulism takes about 3 days to form. It's a toxin that's released by a mold. So it's not a mold itself, which means it's odorless, it's tasteless, and you can't see it, which is what makes it so scary. But that being said, it can only exist in an oxygen-free environment. So if you are stirring up your wort before you put your yeast and putting a lot of oxygen into it, and then the yeast take off within a day, it's almost impossible to have an issue with botulism. The reason I was looking into this is because when I did that experimental no chill, no boil, raw ale, I was concerned because I didn't boil it, and then I let it sit for a couple of days to cool down, and I was concerned that, geez, is there something that could potentially grow in here that could be really bad for me? And the deal is, yeah, that was starting to get on the more dangerous side of, yeah, something could have happened. But it didn't, and I think it's exceedingly rare. And if you're just doing a normal home brew, even if you do no chill like I do and pitch your yeast the following day, like within 24 hours, yeah, I think you're going to be fine. I've never heard of anybody having botulism from homebrew. So that being said, that's what I have to say about that for today. If you liked this video and found it helpful in determining what maybe makes your beer have problems and how to fix those problems, I'd love it if you could hit the thumbs up icon and like the video. That way the algorithms in YouTube will start getting my videos out there and more people can find them and view them. And of course, if you hit the subscribe button, you'll be notified next time I put out the next video, which is generally every Monday morning. And other than that, if you like what you saw, look up, look down. Somewhere here I'm going to link another video in my collection, and you can watch one of those. So until next time, thanks for staying to the end. You made it. You're here. We got through it. Happy brewing.